The planet Zorath was a desolate place, its surface cracked and barren, its skies perpetually shrouded in a haze of dust and ash. The once thriving civilization had been reduced to a handful of survivors, scattered across the wasteland, struggling to eke out an existence. Food was scarce, water even scarcer, and hope was a luxury few could afford. Among the survivors was a young alien woman named Lyra. She was tall and slender, with skin that shimmered like molten silver and eyes that glowed a faint ethereal blue. Lyra had been wandering the wasteland for weeks, her body growing weaker with each passing day. She had long since run out of food, and her water supply was dwindling fast. Desperation had driven her to the edge of madness. One day, as Lyra stumbled through the ruins of a long-abandoned city, she came across a small settlement. The people there were huddled together in makeshift shelters, their faces gaunt and hollow-eyed. They barely glanced at her as she approached, their attention focused on the meager scraps of food they were fighting over. Lyra hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Please, I need food. I haven't eaten in days. I'll do anything. Anything at all." The settlers turned to look at her, their expressions blank and unfeeling. One of them, a grizzled old man with a scar running down his face, sneered at her. "We don't have enough food for ourselves, let alone for some stranger. If you're so desperate, why don't you just offer yourself as food? Maybe then we'll consider helping you." Lyra's heart sank. She had hoped for kindness, for compassion, but all she found was indifference. She looked around at the settlers, her eyes pleading, but no one stepped forward to help her. Despair washed over her, and she felt the last shreds of her hope slipping away. But then, just as she was about to turn and leave, a voice called out from the crowd. "Wait!" Lyra turned to see a man stepping forward. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and piercing green eyes. His face was lined with exhaustion, but there was a strength in his gaze that made Lyra's heart skip a beat. "I'll help you," the man said, his voice firm and resolute. "My name is Kael. Come with me." The settlers murmured among themselves, some of them glaring at Kael with suspicion, but no one tried to stop him as he led Lyra away from the settlement. They walked in silence for a while, until they reached a small, hidden cave tucked away in the side of a rocky hill. Inside the cave, Kael had set up a makeshift camp. There was a small fire burning in the center, and a few scraps of food laid out on a rough-hewn table. Kael gestured for Lyra to sit down, then handed her a piece of dried meat and a cup of water. "Eat," he said simply. "You look like you need it." Lyra hesitated for a moment, then took the food and began to eat. The meat was tough and flavorless, but to her, it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She devoured it quickly, then drank the water in one long gulp. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to repay you." Kael shook his head. "You don't have to repay me. I just couldn't stand by and watch you suffer. It's not right." Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "But why? Why did you help me when no one else would?" Kael was silent for a moment, his gaze distant. "Because I've been where you are," he said finally. "I know what it's like to be alone, to feel like no one cares. I couldn't let you go through that." Lyra felt a lump form in her throat. She had been so focused on her own survival that she had forgotten what it felt like to be cared for, to be valued. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. Over the next few days, Kael and Lyra stayed in the cave, sharing what little food and water they had. Kael told her about his life before the fall of Zorath, about his family and friends who had been lost in the chaos. Lyra, in turn, shared her own story, about how she had been separated from her people and left to fend for herself. As they talked, Lyra began to feel a connection forming between them, a bond that went beyond mere survival. She found herself drawn to Kael, to his strength and kindness, and she could tell that he felt the same way about her. But their time together was short-lived. One day, as they were out scavenging for supplies, they were ambushed by a group of raiders. The raiders were ruthless and well-armed, and Kael and Lyra were quickly overpowered. As the raiders dragged them back to their camp, Lyra felt a surge of despair. She had finally found someone who cared about her, and now they were both going to die. But Kael had other plans. As they were being led into the raiders' camp, he suddenly broke free from his captors and lunged at the leader, knocking him to the ground. The other raiders hesitated for a moment, stunned by the sudden attack, and that was all the opening Kael needed. "Run, Lyra!" he shouted as he fought off the raiders. "Get out of here!" Lyra hesitated for a moment, torn between the desire to help Kael and the need to save herself. But then she saw the determination in his eyes, and she knew that he was willing to sacrifice himself for her. With a heavy heart, Lyra turned and ran, her feet pounding against the hard ground as she fled from the raiders' camp. She didn't stop until she was far away, her chest heaving with exertion and her eyes filled with tears. For days, Lyra wandered the wasteland, searching for any sign of Kael. But he was gone, swallowed up by the harsh landscape and the brutal world they lived in. She was alone once more, but this time, she carried with her the memory of the man who had shown her kindness in a world that had forgotten what it meant to care. As the days turned into weeks, Lyra found herself growing stronger, both in body and in spirit. She had survived the worst that the wasteland could throw at her, and she knew that she could face whatever challenges lay ahead. And though she never found Kael, she never forgot him. He had given her something more precious than food or water. He had given her hope. And with that hope, Lyra knew that she could keep going, no matter how difficult the journey might be. In the end, Lyra's story became a legend among the survivors of Zorath, a tale of courage and compassion in a world that had forgotten both. And though she never saw Kael again, she knew that his spirit lived on in her, guiding her through the darkness and reminding her that even in the bleakest of times, there was still a glimmer of light.